What happens when 500,000 tons of waste are dumped into the ocean? It sounds like environmental damage, but in Florida, something unexpected began to form beneath the surface.
Take a look at this, a barge load of oysters solving problems in a surprising way.
It's a natural storm shield and also improves water quality.
Something no one fully predicted, and something that would quietly reshape an entire coastline. Here is what most people never realized. Florida's coastline was collapsing. Oyster reefs had vanished, water quality declined, and entire ecosystems were breaking down in slow motion. For years, experts searched for solutions, complex, engineered, expensive solutions. But the answer did not come from technology. It came from something discarded. Shells, hundreds of thousands of tons of them, returned to the sea in a move that seemed almost too simple to matter. No guarantees, no certainty. No clear proof that it would work at the scale they needed. And yet, beneath the surface, something began to change. Something that would challenge how we understand restoration and what nature is capable of when, given the chance, even after years of damage and neglect. The coastline that slowly disappeared. In the late 20th century, Florida's coastal waters were quietly falling apart. Oyster reefs that once stretched for miles had nearly disappeared. Overharvesting, pollution, and development had stripped the shoreline of one of its most important natural defenses. The ecosystem was weakening. For centuries, these reefs had done more than people realized. They were not just clusters of shell and stone. They were barriers, living walls that absorbed the force of waves before they reached the shore, and natural filters that cleaned the water hour after hour. A single oyster could process gallons each day. Multiply that by millions, and the entire coastline once functioned as a self-sustaining system. The water stayed clear, balanced, alive. But as the reefs disappeared, the effects began to spread. Shorelines started to erode faster, and sediment filled the water, turning it cloudy and thick. Sunlight could no longer reach the bottom, and when sunlight disappears, entire ecosystems begin to fail. Seagrass beds died off in silence. Fish populations declined. Species that once depended on the reefs simply vanished from certain areas. It was not dramatic, it was gradual, and that made it harder to see. Communities along the coast noticed small changes: fewer fish, murkier water, shorelines shrinking inch by inch. But no single moment signaled disaster. No single event pointed to the cause. The ocean still moved as it always had, and waves still broke along the shore. On the surface, everything looked normal, but beneath that surface, the foundation was gone. Without it, the coastline was no longer protected. Storm surges pushed farther inland, and flooding became more frequent. What once absorbed impact now offered no resistance. The system had lost its balance, and once that balance is gone, it does not return on its own. Something had to change, or the coastline itself would continue to disappear. And few people yet understood how deep the damage had already gone. Something that doesn't add up. Then came a solution that sounded almost too simple to take seriously. The state began dumping massive quantities of discarded oyster shells into the ocean. No advanced systems, no complex engineering, just shells, hundreds of thousands of tons of them.
The shells act as a natural filter to get toxins out of the ecosystem.
At first, it looked less like restoration and more like disposal. Trucks arrived loaded with what most people considered waste: shells from restaurants, fisheries, and processing plants. They were hauled to the coast and dumped into the water in carefully selected locations, forming uneven piles across the seafloor. From above, nothing about it seemed impressive. There were no visible structures taking shape, no dramatic transformation. Just scattered mounds of broken shell resting beneath cloudy water. It raised a simple question. How could something discarded rebuild something destroyed? Marine ecosystems do not respond quickly. They require balance, timing, and conditions that are difficult to recreate once lost. And this approach did not look precise. It looked rough, uncontrolled, almost careless. Even some experts doubted it. The method lacked the complexity of engineered solutions. There were no reinforced materials, no artificial reef systems, no controlled variables, just natural debris placed back into an environment that had already failed. And yet, the dumping continued. More shells were added, more sites were chosen. quietly, without much attention or expectation. Many assumed the shells would simply sink, shift with the tides, and eventually disappear beneath layers of sediment. Lost again. The ocean does not preserve mistakes, it erases them. Storms reshape the seafloor. Currents scatter what is not anchored. What is placed today can be gone tomorrow without a trace. There was no guarantee this would last, no proof it would work. But beneath the surface, something was beginning to respond, slowly, silently, and completely out of sight, waiting for the right conditions to take hold and spread. And if it worked, it would change everything they thought they knew, or prove that some damage cannot be undone. Clues or strange evidence. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then divers started noticing changes. The shells were no longer bare. Tiny oyster larvae had begun attaching themselves, forming clusters that grew thicker with each passing week. It started small, almost invisible. Each larva was no bigger than a grain of sand, drifting through the water with no control over where it would land. Most would never survive. Most never do. But some found the shells, and when they did, something changed. They attached instantly, locking into place as if they had been waiting for this exact surface. The shells were not just debris, they were familiar, recognizable, a signal written into the biology of the species itself. Within weeks, the empty piles began to shift in appearance. What had looked lifeless started to develop texture. Rough edges turned jagged, surfaces thickened, layers formed, then more layers, stacking into something that resembled structure rather than scatter. Divers reported something unusual. The growth was not random, it was concentrated, dense in certain areas, almost deliberate in pattern. That was not expected. Nature usually spreads slowly, unevenly, but here, the clustering seemed accelerated, as if the process had been triggered all at once. Fish began to appear, first a few, then more. Small species returned to hide between the forming structures. Predators followed. The water itself began to change, slightly clearer, slightly brighter with each passing observation. Even the sound underwater shifted. The quiet emptiness was replaced with movement, with feeding, with life returning in layers. Areas once silent now pulsed with activity. Currents carried nutrients through the growing reefs. Small organisms clung to every available surface. Crabs moved in. Algae began to spread across the shells. And still, from above, nothing looked remarkable. But below the surface, something was rebuilding itself. Faster, denser, and more organized than anyone had predicted or prepared for. And the longer it continued, the harder it became to explain what was actually happening.
And one of their biggest things that they do is filter water. They're a water filtering powerhouse. So by creating new oyster reefs, we're helping to solve water quality issues.
A possible theory. Scientists believed the shells were doing more than just sitting on the seafloor. They were sending a signal, a natural cue that told oyster larvae exactly where to settle and grow, restarting a cycle that had once been broken. It was not random, it was biological. Oyster larvae do not attach to just anything. They search as they drift, sensing their environment in ways that are still not fully understood. When they find the right surface, they stop, permanently. Old oyster shells carry that signal. A chemical trace, a texture, something embedded in the material itself. To a larva, it is not debris, it is recognition. That meant every shell placed in the water was more than structure. It was an invitation, a message repeating across the seafloor, calling new life back to a place it once thrived. And once the first oysters settled, the process changed. It accelerated. Each new oyster strengthened the signal. Each layer made the surface more attractive to the next wave of larvae. Growth no longer depended on chance alone. It began to build on itself. This is how reefs form in nature. Slowly at first, then faster still, until the structure becomes dense enough to reshape its surroundings. Water begins to move differently. Sediment settles. Currents shift. The environment adapts around the reef. The shells were not just rebuilding oysters, they were rebuilding conditions. That was the theory. Simple on the surface, but powerful beneath it. Because if it was true, it meant the system had not been destroyed completely. It had only been interrupted. And with this, right trigger, it could start again, not through force or engineering, but through something much older, something already built into the ecosystem itself.
And we want to make sure we don't dig big holes and kill live oysters. That's unacceptable, and so we're
waiting quietly for the moment to return, a system that remembers, a system that rebuilds itself, if given even the smallest chance to begin again. And once it starts, it becomes almost impossible to stop. An obstacle or hidden truth. But for years, this approach remained on the margins. It was considered too simple, too unpredictable, and too slow compared to engineered solutions. Most restoration efforts ignored it entirely. In a world driven by innovation, simplicity is often dismissed. Solutions are expected to be complex, expensive, and precisely designed. This was none of those things. Just shells. That made it easy to overlook. Funding agencies favored projects with clear structures, measurable controls, and immediate results. Concrete reefs, metal frameworks, systems that could be modeled, tested, and scaled with confidence.
We can record weekly so that we have of how much shell we're actually collecting.
Shells did not offer that certainty. They shifted with currents, they settled unevenly. They depended on natural processes that could not be controlled or accelerated. And that uncertainty made them difficult to trust, especially in a system already considered fragile. So the method stayed in the background. Small programs continued quietly, limited in scale, local in impact. Data was collected, but slowly. Results were observed, but rarely amplified beyond scientific circles. There was no defining moment, no dramatic proof, just gradual change. And because it was gradual, it was easy to dismiss. Some early attempts failed. Storms scattered the shells. Poor placement reduced effectiveness. Results varied from site to site. Critics pointed to these inconsistencies as evidence that the method lacked reliability, too fragile, too dependent on chance. But what they missed was timing. Oyster systems do not respond instantly. They require specific conditions: water quality, temperature, salinity. Without those, even the most advanced solutions fail, and those conditions were only beginning to return. The truth was hidden in plain sight. The method was not flawed. It was simply ahead of its moment, waiting for the environment to become ready again. While attention focused elsewhere, the quiet work continued, shell by shell, layer by layer, unnoticed until the results could no longer be ignored by anyone watching closely. Slowly, quietly, the evidence was building beneath the surface, and eventually, that evidence would force a shift no one could ignore. The breakthrough and reveal.
Shells are being repurposed, shall we say. As CBS 2's Carolyn Gussoff shows us, they'll help restore waters once brimming with oysters.
Then the data came in. Water quality improved, marine life returned. Entire reef systems began to form where there had once been nothing. What Florida had created was not just restoration, it was a living system rebuilding itself from the ground up. At first, the numbers seemed too optimistic. Measurements showed clearer water across multiple sites. Suspended sediment dropped, and light began reaching deeper into the water column again. That alone changed everything, because when light returns, life follows. Seagrass beds started to recover, slowly at first, then more consistently. Areas that had been barren for years showed signs of growth again. What once looked like loss began to reverse itself, and with that growth came movement. Fish populations increased, not just in number, but in variety. Species that had not been seen in certain areas began to reappear. Small fish returned first, using the reefs for shelter. Then the predators followed. The structure was working. Each reef began to act like a filter. Oysters fed continuously, removing particles from the water. A single reef could process millions of gallons over time, quietly reshaping the environment around it. The scale was difficult to ignore.
That reef has reduced the erosion rate by half compared to a control site without an oyster reef in front of it.
And it was not just the water. Shorelines began to stabilize. Wave energy weakened before reaching land. Areas once vulnerable to erosion started holding their shape again. The reefs were becoming barriers, living barriers built from the ocean itself. What had been placed as scattered shells had transformed into dense, layered formations. Hard, complex, interconnected, self-sustaining. That was the turning point. It meant the system no longer depended on constant human intervention. It had crossed a threshold, from restoration to regeneration. And once that threshold is crossed, the process continues on its own. The ocean had taken over. What Florida started, the ecosystem finished, expanding, strengthening, and proving that recovery was not only possible, but already underway, and it was happening faster than anyone had predicted.
So why not grab those shells and put them out in the bay?
Hands-on oyster shell recycling program is underway,
reshaping the coastline in ways few expected. What Florida revealed was not just a method, it was a principle. Ecosystems do not always need to be rebuilt from scratch. Sometimes they only need the right signal to begin again. The oyster shells did not force the ocean to recover. They reminded it how. That changes everything because it suggests that damage is not always permanent, that collapse does not always mean the end, that within even the most degraded systems, there may still be a blueprint waiting to be reactivated if we understand how to trigger it. But it also raises a deeper question. If something this simple was overlooked for so long, what else have we ignored? What other solutions have been dismissed because they did not look advanced enough, or fast enough, or impressive enough to believe? And more importantly, how many ecosystems are still waiting for the one thing that could bring them back before it is too late to reverse what has already been lost? And will we recognize it in time? If you want to uncover more hidden stories like this, subscribe now, because the most powerful discoveries are often the ones hiding in plain sight.